Welcome to the Cult Classic Horror Show. Every week, you can have the conversations you've always wanted to have about the films you love.
Shut up!
We're gonna get you, not another peep.
Get rid of your distractions and prepare yourself.
Then lock your door. 5, 6, crucifix.
You got a big surprise coming to you. You're not going anywhere.
Welcome everybody to the Cult Classic Horror Show. Danny Bonin here with you. And I have a very special guest today. I want to welcome Nicholas McCarthy, director of upcoming film The Prodigy, on the line with me. How's it going, Nicholas?
It's going great. Glad to be here.
Good. Thanks for joining me.
I'm so ready for this.
Are you? These films can be such a long process that right when they're about to go, it's like, the nerves are there and you're ready. So tell me a little bit. Of course, I want to talk about the film. I want to get there. I know a lot of the fans, even listeners, are excited to see it. We've seen the previews. But before we jump into that, I read a little bio on you. I know your love for horror may or may not have started with The Exorcist, as sort of mine did as well. Tell us a little bit about your history. Like, how did you get into directing? How did you get into film? How did you get into horror?
Mm-hmm. Well, I grew up in Hanover, New Hampshire, which, like most small towns in New Hampshire, like in the 1970s, wasn't like filled with a world where you could see all sorts of films or any kind of culture.
Yeah, of course.
But there was Dartmouth College in Hanover, and they had a film society. And I was able to see some movies that really made an impact on me. Like I saw my first Hitchcock movie there. But what I really kind of responded to in the genre was the whole world of old monster movies, science fiction, horror films,
sure,
that were on UHF.
Oh, okay.
TV stations.
Yeah.
And for me, I did not want to go outside and play sports like my brothers. Like, I would rather sit and watch, a movie on TV. And there was this amazing block of programming coming out of Boston called the Creature Double Feature, and that's where I saw, Tarantula, the movie about the giant tarantula,
yep.
And I saw, the movie about the giant ants, them. But I also saw these, 70s made-for-TV movies that just completely turned my head around, like Don't Be Afraid of the Dark, and Trilogy of Terror, and it felt like there was this whole world there that I was just getting a little piece of. And when I saw The Exorcist, and that was shown to me, I'm not joking, by a kid named Damien on a Betamax. And I could only get through probably about the first 45 minutes of that movie because it was so upsetting to me. I was about 10 or 11 years old. And it haunted me for years. And in some ways, like, for me to kind of reconcile, myself with, the ability, the power that movie had, that was kind of what I was trying to figure out. Like, how could a film be that powerful? And it took me a while. And I do watch that movie every couple of years. But it was one of those seminal moments for me as a kid.
Sure.
That got me into thinking about, that this is something I wanted to be a part of because it was so powerful.
Wow. No, I share a similar story. I saw it when I was way too young. It was one of those where, the stepdad was watching it on TV and I just happened to walk around the corner, like right when she's fully possessed in bed, and I'm like, no. And,
Yeah.
and it did. I must have sat there for like 10 minutes watching it, and pretty much all nightmares in my childhood have to do with that, or possession, or anything. And so it had a profound effect on me. So you're not alone, that's for sure.
Yeah. It was a troubling movie. I think there was about 3 years there where I had trouble going to sleep, nearly every night, because I would think about her face. And let me tell you, it took a while before I even finished that movie, that I was able to see the climax of that film. But it was really the vibe of that first, 45 minutes or so that was so frightening to me. And to kind of bring it full circle, the Prodigy, as far as, what the film, which films influenced that movie, my movie, I would say The Exorcist is a huge influence, but in particular that first 45 minutes or an hour of The Exorcist, as Ellen Burstyn is kind of reconciling herself, figuring out this thing is happening with her daughter. That vibe, it was kind of what I wanted. And Jeff Bueller, the writer, had written the hypnotism scene that you see in a couple of the trailers, which for me, I thought, okay, now here's my chance to kind of pay homage to one of my favorite scenes in The Exorcist, which is, the scene where she's hypnotized.
Oh no, that's brilliant. And I mean, I can relate. Some people, don't particularly, I don't know what the word is, I guess, enjoy the slow build up, but it just builds that, like, tension's not even the word, it's dread. I think it's total, complete dread,
Yeah.
And sorry, I'm looking at the notes here. It was it Vincent that had something to do with Exorcism of Emily Rose that is now?
Yes.
Okay.
So Trip Vincent, like the way that this movie kind of came together was I had directed a couple of, small horror films, The Pact and At the Devil's Door.
Sure.
And Trip, The Exorcism of Emily Rose was a movie that he had kind of put together, was the main producer on, and he had discovered Scott Derrickson for that movie. Mm-hmm. I think they maybe had gone to college together. Oh. And he knew that Scott was someone who was kind of destined for great things, and he knew that Scott was really interested in horror films. So he was the one who got that movie off the ground, and it was kind of his first claim to fame. Mm-hmm. And so when he approached me for the very first time, he was essentially coming to me with this pitch that was like, I want to do for you what you did, what I did for Scott Derrickson, The Exorcism of Emily Rose, because he had seen The Pact, and he just thought that I was someone who could direct a studio movie. Now, for me, like, making a choice about career, like, that always comes second to what the material would be. Yeah. And fortunately, the script for this movie that Jeff Bueller had written was so fascinating and encompassed so many it touched on a bunch of different stuff inside the horror genre that I'd wanted to attack, not the least of which was making an evil kid movie, because I'm such a fan of that kind of whole subgenre. And what Jeff did with it was kind of essentially, kind of tell that familiar story that from The Bad Seed and Village of the Damned, sure, and all these other movies. But then he went somewhere else with it. And I guess I shouldn't say, but that was the thing that kind of hooked me into it, is that it was clever, it was sick, it had a kind of real dark sense of humor, which I connected to, and then it kind of took off at some point in a place that I never thought that it was going to go.
Sure.
Let's say this: it's not a horror movie that ends with an exorcism.
There's plenty of those.
Yeah.
I will say, though, having Vincent as part of it, and also with your previous work, I mean, The Pact and At the Devil's Door, great job. Those are great movies, by the way. Just as a horror fan, I do enjoy them. So, and The Pact is one of those that it's I don't know if I've seen it in a bit, but you'll be scrolling Netflix and it's just one of those covers that jumps out at you, you know. So
it's funny. Yeah, that movie, I mean, it really kind of gave me everything. And when I made it, just as probably a lot of people feel this way making their first feature, my memory of it is just kind of getting through day by day, trying to tell the story that I wanted to tell, to put together a movie that at least someone would see. And then, it premiered at Sundance. It had quite a big theatrical release overseas. And then, it was on Netflix for years and years. And I don't know how many people had reached out because they had seen that film. And it's incredible. We made it for $400,000.
Wow.
In a little house in, here in LA. And it was like, sometimes you do something and it just gets seen by everybody.
Yeah.
So it's a pretty amazing experience making that movie.
No, that's great. Well, what I was getting at is that with your track record with that, and with Trim Vincent being lead producer on Exorcism of Emily Rose, because I mean really Exorcism of Emily Rose is sort of almost my second after The Exorcist. That creeped me out the most. Probably has something to do with my age watching it. I saw Exorcism of Emily Rose in theaters when it came out. I'm a bit younger. I was probably 18 or 19 or something at the time. So I don't know the exact year. I'm like 33 right now. But I remember being equally as freaked out. There's not quite as many visuals as far as effects goes or makeup goes for that movie, but just the way that it's shot and the way the story goes and the way she contorts herself is just so having Tripp involved with this just makes me even more intrigued to want to go see it.
Yeah, well, I got to know Scott Derrickson, a little bit over the years, and I think one of the powers of that film is that Scott's a believer. He thinks this stuff is real.
Yeah,
and so there's a kind of intense edge to some of the imagery in that movie, which I really appreciate. And Tripp was a fantastic producer on this movie. What was really special though was that we also had Jeff, and as our writer, and Jeff essentially was a guy who, early on he wrote The Midnight Meat Train. Mm-hmm. And he, after that, kind of became someone who was, a screenwriter known for writing horror in Hollywood. And what that means is if you want to make a living, if you're lucky enough to make a living, you are writing what the open assignments are. And they were all reboots and remakes and sequels, And, God bless him for paying him to, or paying anyone to write anything. But I think for this movie, what was really exciting to Jeff was this idea that he could invent this whole world. Mm-hmm. That wasn't a remake. It wasn't a sequel. And even though it does draw from this really familiar, well of evil kid movies, Jeff kind of built this whole thing from the ground up. And so he was so excited about it. And it's so important to have, someone like that who's your writer.
Yeah. Well, and he's definitely getting in one of those remakes, obviously, with Pet Sematary coming up here. So.
Yeah, I know. It's ridiculous. Well, he has Pet Sematary, but he also wrote the reboot of The Grudge and the reboot of Jacob's Ladder. All of those films have been shot, and they're all supposed to be released this year, which is hilarious.
Wow. Yeah, I'm actually, I pulled him up right now. I'm seeing Jacob's Ladder. I didn't even know that they were doing that. That's crazy.
Yeah, I think they did it. We'll have to see how it turns out.
Wow. Well, no, that's great that he's getting that work and that you had that caliber of writing done on this. And how did this? Now, did Jeff reach out to you to have you do this, or how did that come about? How
did the movie get made? Well, I had made those two films, and they were made for The Pact was made for $400,000. I think Devil's Door was made for like $700,000. Mm-hmm. And I think when we were cutting Devil's Door, The Conjuring came out, and I went and saw The Conjuring, and with an audience that were just screaming, and it was a really great experience. And that was a kind of reminder to me all over again that I really wanted to direct a film that could reach a lot of people, like in this genre, And and so Trip had this idea for, and I don't want to give too much away, but the Prodigy comes from it's based on a true story. Essentially, the kind of horror mythos that's happening in it is something that people believe. And there was this documented case that this couple had written a book about their son, and Tripp, because he knew Jeff, said, "Would you be interested in writing a horror movie about this idea?" And so the script was sent to me, and it was sent 4 years before we actually made the movie. And what happened was, I think this movie got set up and fell apart at every different studio in town.
Yeah.
It's a familiar story. You've heard it a million times from filmmakers, but this was the first time that it's happened to me, where I would get a phone call. It's like, oh, it looks like it's going to happen, and then you get a phone call 3 days later that it had fallen apart. But what was the good news there was that we had the time to continue to work on the thing. And I had the time because would have to go into these meetings and pitch the film. I had time to think about it. And by the time we found the new Orion Pictures, that would be our home, which is kind of a whole other story, I think we had really landed in a place where we knew what this movie was. And so, it was terrible that it took that long to get made, but it was kind of like a Goldilocks kind of situation, because at the end of the day, like, Orion Pictures was amazing. And we were the first ever new Orion Pictures production since the 90s.
Really? Oh,
yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And I associate, that label, the Orion Pictures logo, which is like right at the top of our movie.
Oh, sure.
It's so many movies that changed my life when I was a kid, like RoboCop and The Silence of the Lambs. And, so that's kind of how the movie got made, is that it didn't get made at a whole bunch of different places until we found the place that wanted to make it.
No, that's good. It's good to have, the production company or the, on your side, the studio on your side, wanting you to do well. And were they pretty good about not, messing with things and letting you do what you wanted to do?
Well, it's like, that's another story that you hear a lot about, filmmakers have to do, doing battle with the studio. And I think the truth is a little more complex than that. And this was my first studio film. And there was, a feeling going into it. Of course, that was just, I might have been putting on the process a little bit just from like reading so many stories and talking to other directors who had had issues. Sure. But the truth is, whether it's like a studio or whether, you're making an independent film, it just kind of comes down to the people you're making it with. And the guys at Orion just had a great sense about what the film could be. They were really amenable to, things that I wanted to do with the movie, and their notes were generally really, really good. What was different for me making a movie at this, for a studio, was that, the actual shooting of the film felt a lot like those independent films, but there just were more people there. It was a union crew. Mm-hmm. And even though me and my DP, who shot my other two films, on a day-to-day basis, it did feel like we were making The Pact, like a $400,000 movie sometimes, where we just, be fighting to get, something.
Yeah.
It was amazing to work with just really amazing, experienced crew people. And like, a really mundane example of this is like at some point in the first week, I was standing there as, we were setting up to do something. And I looked over and there's this guy who was our dolly grip. Mm-hmm. And what a dolly grip does is they push and pull the dolly that the camera's on, right? And they're also in charge of actually moving it around between scenes. Like we would be shooting in a house and this guy would be in charge of, navigating it upstairs or whatever. And it seems like this arbitrary thing, but like I had never worked on a movie that had a dolly grip. It was always like, one of the assistant camera people would be pushing the dolly or the key grip would be pushing the dolly. And this guy was so good at his job. I would communicate from the DP and he would communicate to the camera operator and that guy would communicate to the dolly grip. It was like, we just kind of want to give just a slight push to this to kind of just give it a little bit of intensity. Yeah. And like every time this guy would nail exactly what we wanted, and that's kind of the difference of like when you're making a movie with a little bit of money. Yeah.
Everyone's trained and good at what they do and ready to do it.
Yeah, man. And it makes a difference. And so and then I think the other big difference was that in post, you do these test screenings, and of course that's also the stuff of legend, right? Like, yeah. But I found it really helpful. It was a moment, with the first time that we previewed the film where like I sat down and I was thinking to myself, I'm looking at this audience. It's like a multiplex, filled with like, 400 people or whatever, wow. And I'm looking around at them and I'm like, how are they gonna respond to this movie? Not because I didn't think the movie worked. I thought it worked great, but it's R-rated and it's a horror movie, and without revealing too much, there's just shit that happens that's not the kind of thing that you would think an audience would embrace, because it's disturbing, Yeah. It's nasty. And by the way, the design of the movie isn't like that. It's like you're getting hit over the head, every step of the way by something violent and disturbing. The whole method was like that. It would be really quiet and tense. And then when something would happen that I just wanted people to feel it, to feel that R rating,
sure.
And so, what the movie played, and then they everyone fills out cards, and then they do this focus group, right? And there's like 20 people that are called to this focus group because they get promised like a free movie ticket or something if they participate. And the guy who runs the focus group said, the first thing he said is, how many people like the movie? And it was like, out of 20 people, it was like 18 or 19 hands all raised their hands saying they liked it. And that was great, of course, because most importantly, they liked the movie.
Sure.
But it kind of proved to me that's something about horror, is that you can get away with really twisted, diabolical things. And people who might normally not think about, wanting to go to see a movie because they get to see that stuff are just with it because they just think, oh, it's a horror movie.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's what we love. So yeah. the more the better. So
merrier.
Yeah. Now I do want to get into a little bit about the cast and everything. You have a lot of seasoned actors here. Was it with Taylor Schilling, Colm Feore here, and was it? I know you've worked with some great people before, but was it at all intimidating to come in and work with these types of names?
I don't know if it was I guess it was a bit intimidating, but it's intimidating working with anybody because you just don't know.
Yeah.
What they're going to be like. And the first time I sat down with Taylor, and I wanted her to be in this movie, and the first time I sat down with her, I just knew that she was going to be terrific because she just showed me just by who she is that she was a very serious actress and that this was going to be something that she wasn't going to walk through, that everything had to be real for her. And that's what I wanted. So that commitment was just remarkable. And she was so fun to work with on set, because like it always had to feel like, like nothing could be fake for her. She had to kind of be there in whatever that moment was. And there's some pretty intense stuff that she does. And it was just fun to kind of guide her through that stuff. And the other part of that equation was, who was going to play Miles, the little boy. And when I met Jackson, it just was one of those moments where, we had him put himself on tape a few times, and I had been giving him direction through his parents. Each time he would kind of put these auditions on tape from where he lives. And then they flew to Los Angeles for a callback, and just sitting across from him. And he actually did a version of the hypnotism scene that I had written for the audition. And it was just so plain, that it was like that this kid was just transforming into the character.
Oh, that's great.
And then what was remarkable is like, then as soon as we stepped out of the room and he's hanging around with his dad, Jackson just was like every other third grader, like he just is messing around and joking and drinking root beer and like, and I have a kid that's his age. And so it was, I could tell, right away that there was, something magical about him.
Wow.
So that he did it and that we could put him together with Taylor was just amazing. And as far as Colm, he didn't need to do this movie. He did it because he's in Exorcism of Emily Rose and Tripp asked to do it, and so I had never met Colm, and I just had a phone call with him a couple days before he came to set to do his first scene. And his role in this movie is essentially like the guy who comes in and is going to explain like a shit ton of exposition, which is a thankless role for any actor. And so I said to Colm, like, I wanted to just talk to him and introduce myself before we actually worked together. And I said to him, look, on Wednesday you're going to come in and you've got like 7 pages of dialogue that you're going to deliver. And I said, I'm sorry. And he said, I'll never forget this. He said, oh no, I know exactly who this guy is. He asked me maybe 2 questions about him, about the character. And then he said, I think you shouldn't call off any dinner plans you have that night. We're going to be breaking early that day because I think we're going to blaze through this. And this was like a ton of dialogue and with 3 actors. And we broke 3 hours early that day. The only day we finished, and it was all because of Colm. Like we would set up the camera and I would say action and he would deliver whatever chunk we were doing of the scene. And then I'd call cut and I'd kind of look around thinking like, why do I even have to do this again? Every time he was so good. So he was just a real pleasure. And then a bunch of other people we got in the cast are amazing. And I've got to mention Peter Mooney, who plays Taylor's husband, was terrific, really good actor. And then Brittany Allen, who is in a whole bunch of interesting movies.
Yeah, she has quite the horror resume.
She does. Well, her boyfriend Colin is a director, and they just made like a really interesting movie, which kind of rocked South by. And so Brittany kind of came from this world, and I had never met her before, and she actually just came in to read, and it was like one of those things, like within 90 seconds I was like, she's got the part, like she's so good in this movie.
Wow.
So yeah, I was really really happy with everyone who we found.
Oh, that's awesome. And so how long was principal photography on this?
It was about 30 days, and we shot it in March and April of this last year. So,
okay. And you guys were up in Canada, right?
Yeah, we shot it in Toronto. The movie takes place in Pennsylvania and also Ohio, and that was important to me. And like as with any film now, like it's really hard to shoot in America, which is absurd.
Yeah.
And I thought it was really important that the movie be set in America. So, you know, while there are no like landmarks that we needed to recreate, kind of dusting up the frame with just enough kind of Midwest was our kind of job with it, you know? Mm-hmm. And, you know, I'd be curious if anyone kind of catches on why that might be important to the film. But to me, it always felt like this kind of American story about these people with a kind of aspiration with this child of looking forward, having some hope for the future, and then basically just being fucking crushed.
Yeah. Without giving it away, right? No, that's great. So, wow. Well, yeah, so it, gosh, well, I have other questions too, but I sort of want to, if you don't mind, jump back a little bit. You had talked about, you know, getting introduced to horror at a young age. How did you get into directing then? I mean, was this something you always wanted to do, or did you have a previous profession before this?
No, it was always what I wanted to do. And I guess like probably any horror fan, like when I saw that stuff on TV, when I saw those, you know, monster movies, and it's like your DNA is just programmed to find that stuff, you know? And, I, you know, knew that that not only was I obsessed with movies, but I somehow had to make them. And I think once I saw Jaws, which I saw in a kind of, it was like a re-release of Jaws.
Okay.
That was like the thing that kind of locked it for me, where I said, you know, I want to make movies.
Wow.
And I think, the first films I made were Super 8. You know, I made Super 8 horror films when I was about 10, 11 years old. And, you know, it's a familiar story to like a lot of young guys. And now thankfully there's some women actually making horror movies. Like we all kind of did anything we could to find a way to, like, you know, kind of make these little short films as kids. And eventually I went to film school at SUNY Purchase, State University of New York at Purchase, and lived in New York City for a while. There was like a film that I was making there that was, you know, kind of it was like the lost period in my life in my 20s when I was making some kind of quasi art movie that, you know, never really got finished. But I moved out to LA in 2000, and I just knew that I wanted to make movies somehow. I didn't know how they would get made, or how they got made, but I knew I wanted to do it. And so I just kept making short films. And eventually I started to play them at festivals, and I tried writing screenplays. I joined a writer's group where we would get together every week and read our work to one another. And eventually I wrote, you know, my first script, which was a horror script. And, you know, I'd always been inspired by these people who, whether they continue to make horror films or not, that horror films were their first films.
Yeah.
You know, and so with that kind of, you know, that legacy of people like Joe Dante and, you know, John Carpenter and George Romero.
Sure.
I wrote a horror script that got me my first meetings, and eventually was paid a little bit of money to write something. But really it was when I did the short film of The Pact, which people can see online now. It's a pretty peculiar movie, but one I've always been really proud of, where essentially, like, I had never really as a director, as a grown-up person, done something that felt like a genre piece. Like everything that I had been doing kind of when I was in my 20s and 30s were more like character pieces. I was just trying to work with actors, and I can't exactly say why. Like, it took me a while to kind of circle back to horror when it came time to making films, but I did with the Pact short film, and it's a peculiar short film because it starts as a kind of character drama. It's 10 minutes long, and then the second half becomes this ghost story. And I didn't intend it to be a seed for a feature. Like, I didn't intend it to be, you know, a scene.
Sure.
But then I had this meeting with these guys who, financed small budget movies. And they said, this seems like it's a part of a feature script, and I said, yeah, it is. There was no script that had been written, slide to them. And then I went and wrote it in about 5 or 6 weeks. And then I kind of came back to them with it, and they said, let's make it.
Wow.
And so that's kind of how I got my break. And really, it's, sometimes really hard to, put together a year in Hollywood. It's just been, it was a dream come true to make that film and have it seen by so many people. But it also solidified this idea for me that, there's no reason for me not to make horror films for the rest of my life. A lot of times you hear people say, well, now that I've made horror films, I want to move on to doing something, as if it's a respectable thing or something.
Yeah.
I'm like, please let me be disrespectable my whole life, know. So.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, gosh, I mean, this has got to be exciting for you then, because this big release, and I think I saw the preview when I was just watching Halloween, or it was some big. I was in the theater. I think I saw the preview or something. So that's just cool. That's cool to. I always love hearing the story. So
there's a lot of them. I feel like every filmmaker that I talk to, almost all of them, it's just a dream that they chased after, and they kind of didn't give up. And there's luck involved. But it's
wow.
that's the whole thing. It's that whole idea of the kind of craziness of having to believe in this thing and chase after and having it come true. That is pretty much true of everyone I know who directs movies.
Wow. Well, I know you got something else coming up here. You're a busy guy, I'm sure, with the release of the film. But this will be coming out February 8th, so all you guys listening need to go check it out, get in the theaters and see this thing. I know I'll be there. I mean, pulling from your influences, and like I already said, from the people you're working with, it's bound to be a hit. So, what before we wrap up, anything on the horizon? You got anything else in the works right now?
Well, I can't really say, but one of the things that's really, I got sent a lot of different scripts and had written a couple of things on my own the last couple of years. But whatever I do is the next thing. I just want to make sure it's something that I want to see in a movie theater. I mean, that's why I made The Prodigy, is because I read the script and I said, man, I want to be in an audience and experience what they're experiencing. Mm-hmm. So it's been more turning things down than picking things up.
Sure.
So I can't really say what's next, but whatever it is, I'm gonna. Hopefully, it'll be a gift to horror fans.
Well, I'm sure we'll welcome it.
Right.
Well, awesome. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time, Nicholas, and we're all excited to see this thing.
Good. No, I was happy to talk to you, man. Let's do it again.
All right, for sure. Well, thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you guys next week.
Don't you blame the movies. Movies don't create psychos. Movies make psychos more creative.
Oh, yes. There will be blood.